I'm no longer satisfied by the divine conceptualist argument that I have on this channel already. There's a lot of background assumptions within the argument that I don't think I really agree with anymore. So here is a fresh attempt at making an argument for divine conceptualism. My main inspirations for the particular formulation of this argument are people like William Vallicella, Dwight Goodyear, and Leibniz specifically. So premise 1 begins by stating that propositions are truth bearers. Now this is a common position among philosophers, so it's not that controversial. Propositions are entities which are about things, specifically. So a proposition is something like, I exist. The proposition I exist is about some state of affairs, namely me existing. So the proposition is a truth bearer, namely, it's something that could be true. Truth could belong to it, in a sense. Now premise 2 states that truth makers are what determine the truth value of truth bearers. So let's look at that proposition again, I exist. Now, the proposition I exist is a truth bearer. Truth could belong to it. Now, it could either be true or false, which would be the truth value of that proposition. And there would have to be something that determines the truth value of that proposition. And the thing that would determine the truth value of that proposition would precisely be a truth maker. So, for example, one might be able to say that the truth maker for the proposition I exist is my actual existence. My concrete actual existence serves as the truth maker for the proposition I exist. Now, in this video, I'm not going to discuss what kinds of things are truth makers, because it isn't relevant for this argument that I'm making. So, from premise 1 and premise 2, it follows that, therefore, truth makers determine the truth value of propositions. Now, premise 4. It is possible that truth makers exist. Now, this premise is very clearly more plausibly true than not. It'd be very difficult to deny the possibility of truth makers. We can once again use the proposition, I exist, as an example. So, if one denies premise 4, and truth makers are impossible, then there is no truth maker for the proposition, I exist, and there cannot be one in principle. This position would lead to the conclusion that if it is true that I exist, then there's nothing that makes that true, which seems highly implausible. I think we are in a safe position to accept the truth of premise 4. Premise 5 states that by S5, which is an axiom of modal logic, what is possible is necessarily possible, meaning that it is possible in all possible worlds. If any given possibility, P, for example, is not necessarily possible, then it is contingently possible, which means that this given possibility, P, is possible relative to one or some possible worlds, and is not possible relative to one or some possible worlds. The falsity of such an idea can be seen from the following. If a given possibility, P, is contingently possible, then there are some worlds in which it is not possible. But for something to be not possible is to be impossible. And in modal logic, the impossibility of P can be reworded to say that it is necessary that it is not the case that P. But to say that it is necessary that it is not the case that P entails that P is not possible with respect to any possible world at all. So the view that argues that a given possibility, P, can be contingently possible collapses into the view that P is in fact necessarily impossible. Therefore, any given possibility must be necessarily possible. Therefore, it follows that it is necessarily possible that truth makers exist. Now, if the existence of truth makers is necessarily possible, then the possibility that truth makers determine the truth value of propositions is necessarily possible. Now, the existence of a truth maker entails that some truth bearer is made true. Otherwise, the thing in question that exists is not a truth maker. So it must be the case that if it is possible that some truth maker exists, then it is possible that that truth maker makes something true. And so if the existence of truth makers is necessarily possible, then it is necessarily possible that truth makers determine the truth value of some truth bearer. And this is the explanation for premise 7. Now, from premise 8, propositions must exist in order for it to be possible for truth makers to determine their value. Remember, if it is possible that some truth maker exists, then it is possible that that truth maker determines the truth value of some truth bearer, or proposition. Since the existence of a truth maker entails that some proposition is made true by it, then it must be the case that the proposition in question exists prior to the truth maker's actualization. The existence of a proposition is an ontologically prior condition for the actualization of a truth maker. We can find something analogous to this in the view that existence is not a property, because properties only instantiate within an existent individual. So the existence of an individual is an ontologically prior condition for the instantiation of any properties. This is why premise 8 must be true. Propositions must exist in order for it to be possible for some truth maker to determine the truth value of some proposition. So, if we affirm that it is possible that truth makers exist, and that therefore it is necessarily possible that truth makers exist, and that therefore it is necessarily possible that some truth makers determine the truth value of some proposition, and that propositions must exist in order for this possibility to obtain, then therefore propositions must necessarily exist. Now we move on to premise 10, which states that propositions are best construed as thoughts, and there are several reasons for believing this. First of all, propositions, as I mentioned earlier, are intrinsically intentional. They are about something, or they represent some state of affairs. Here I'll quickly make the distinction between intrinsic and derivative intentionality. So intrinsic intentionality is the intentionality something has in virtue of being what it is. So thoughts. Thoughts are intrinsically intentional because thoughts are always thoughts about something, whereas a map is derivatively intentional. What a map represents isn't in virtue of the physical markings of the map. Its intentionality is derivative upon the intentionality that we impose upon it. The only other place we find intrinsic intentionality, other than propositions, is within conscious experience, since conscious experience is a kind of intrinsically intentional experience. So in addition to the fact that propositions are intrinsically intentional, it would be in accordance with Occam's razor, simplicity, parsimony, to include propositions as mental entities. So we don't have to multiply categories of entities beyond necessity. One may respond and say, well, perception is intentional. So why are propositions best understood as thoughts if thoughts and perceptions are both intentional? Why aren't propositions best understood as perceptions? Well, the issue is that, yes, perception is intentional, in that there is an object-directedness. Perception is directed towards an object. But it'd be strange to say that perception is about something, whereas thoughts are clearly about something. Now, I have a few more reasons to believe that propositions are mental entities of sorts. Firstly, since we are construing propositions as thoughts, let's analyze the intentionality of thoughts. If I conjure a thought about the Eiffel Tower, then the object of my thought is the Eiffel Tower. It isn't that the thought is the object, the Eiffel Tower is the object that my thought represents. But the thing is that if the Eiffel Tower goes out of existence, that doesn't change the content of my thought whatsoever. I can still think about the Eiffel Tower, whether the Eiffel Tower exists or not. Now, presumably, this is a feature of intrinsic intentionality, and thus would apply to these non-mental kinds of propositions. And thus, these non-mental propositions could still be intrinsically intentional, whether the object that they are directed towards exists or not, just like with the Eiffel Tower. But returning to thoughts, it isn't just that an object is being represented by a thought. It is being represented to a subject, so that even though the object of the thought can exist or not exist, there is still something that is being represented to a subject. Now, as we saw, these non-mental propositions would be intrinsically intentional with or without the existence of the object, as was just explained. But since these propositions are non-mental, it would also have to be true that these propositions can be intrinsically intentional without representing anything to and for a subject. So these non-mental propositions could be such that there is no existing object which it represents, but also such that it isn't representing to anything. In the case of thoughts, at least thoughts are representing to something. Thoughts are representing something to a subject, whereas these non-mental propositions wouldn't be representing to anything. But it seems that it's precisely in the nature of representation to represent to something. So these non-mental propositions turn out to be non-representing representations, which is incoherent. To sort of summarize this line of reasoning, we can formulate it into a simple syllogism. 1. Every instance of intrinsic intentionality has both a subject and an object. 2. Non-mental intrinsic intentionality is intentionality without a subject. 3. Therefore, there are no instances of non-mental intrinsic intentionality. One could also add the correlativity of subject and object in defense of this line of reasoning, such that there can be no subject without an object and no object without a subject, a topic which I have explored briefly in my 2 Trinitarian videos. I think we're in a pretty good place to move on. So, therefore, if propositions necessarily exist, and propositions are best construed as thoughts, then propositions are necessarily existing thoughts. Now, premise 12 states that thoughts are grounded in or by minds. There's no such thing as free-floating thoughts. Thoughts are always thoughts of a mind, and the existence of thoughts are grounded by minds. This is pretty uncontroversial. But then it follows that, therefore, there is a necessarily existing mind, or minds, plural, that grounds these necessary propositions. Premise 14 states that several rational considerations prevent the acceptance of multiple necessary minds grounding these propositions. Firstly, anything which can be said to exist by way of metaphysical necessity is such that its essence cannot be distinct from its existence. In other words, for a thing to exist of metaphysical necessity is for it to exist in virtue of what it is, or in virtue of its essence. But for something to exist in virtue of its essence means that there is no distinction between what it is and the fact that it is. If this was not the case, and a thing's essence and existence were really distinct, then there would need to be an external unifier which unifies that thing's essence and existence, and as such, this being would be contingent in principle. So, a metaphysically necessary existent would be purely actual. And since there can only be one concrete entity which is purely actual, there can only be but one necessary mind to ground the existence of these propositions. However, I must make the distinction between something purely actual in a qualified sense and purely actual in an unqualified sense, as this distinction is the basis for objecting that there can really be multiple entities which are purely actual. For example, an objection could be as follows. A purely actual being is one whose essence is identical with its existence, as previously explained. But why couldn't it be the case that we have essence A and essence B, for example, which are different essences, and they are each identical to their own respective acts of existence, existence A and existence B, so that essence A is identical to existence A, and essence B is identical to existence B. Yet these are two different concrete entities. The objection rests on the qualified sense of the phrase purely actual. It is qualified because the essence in question is identical to its own particular existence, and not existence itself. So the existence which is said to be identical to this essence is just a particular instance of existence, and so is not exhaustive. But a particular instance of existence presupposes that there is something which it is an instance of, which would be existence itself. The objection would not work against a concrete entity whose essence is identical to existence itself. There cannot be two essences which are identical to existence itself and also distinct, since the transitivity of identity would collapse these essences into a single one. An essence identical to existence itself would be the unqualified sense of purely actual, which I mentioned, and should really be called pure actuality instead. There is also the question of whether something can only be purely actual in the qualified sense without being unqualified pure actuality, which does not seem to be the case. If a thing's essence is only its particular existence, then it is an unactualized actual being. But the existence of a thing is its primary act, which grounds all its other acts. And since potencies only have being insofar as they are grounded in something actual, by way of Aristotelian actualism, then if the being has no potencies relative to its own existence, then it cannot have any potencies whatsoever, and this being must be pure actuality itself, in its unqualified infinitude. Since there can only be one pure actuality, as explained, there is only one purely actual necessary mind which grounds these propositions. Even if there could somehow exist multiple necessary minds, there is another line of reasoning which explains why it is rational to hold that only one necessary mind can ground propositions. Firstly, if propositions are grounded in multiple minds, either each mind grounds all propositions equally, or the propositions are distributed, such that some minds ground some propositions and not others, but all propositions in total are grounded. If the propositions are distributed, then it is a complete brute fact, as there cannot be an explanation in principle about how or why the propositions are distributed in the way that they are. However, if each mind grounds all the same propositions, then it is ad hoc to postulate multiple minds when a single mind could suffice. And there is also explanatory overdetermination here. It also entails the strange consequence that there would be multiple Pythagorean theorems, for example. So there would be no such thing as the Pythagorean theorem, only a Pythagorean theorem among several, which would obliterate the objectivity criterion for propositions. The objectivity criterion states that when we refer to a proposition, like the Pythagorean theorem, we are referring to one and the same thing, which is a necessary condition in order to have genuine communication about it. Otherwise, we could never know whether we are talking about the same proposition or not. More importantly, though, there is an infinite number of propositions, and as such, there is no set of all propositions, since the power set of a set with infinite members would have the same cardinality as the original set, which would violate Cantor's theorem. Now, clearly something finite cannot ground the existence of something infinite, so the necessary mind must be infinite. Now, infinity is exhaustive and full, whereas the finite is inexhaustive and lacking, since finitude implies a particular way of being, as opposed to some other particular way of being. Qualification is a mark of finitude, and so something purely actual, in the mere qualified sense, would be finite. And this can also be seen by the fact that a qualified, purely actual being is only such that its essence is identical with its particular existence and not existence itself, so that there could be multiple of these beings in principle. A being could only be infinite if it is unqualified pure actuality, whose essence is identical to its existence and to existence itself, as existence in and of itself is infinite and unqualified, whereas mere existence instances are finite and qualified. However, I've already shown earlier that a qualified purely actual being would also have to be unqualified pure actuality, and thus infinite and uniquely singular, a being who is identical to its own existence and to existence itself. So there can't even be such a thing as a merely qualified purely actual being. I'm sure there are more ways I could argue in defense of the 14th premise, but this seems to be sufficient for now. So we can conclude that, therefore, there is a single necessarily existing mind that grounds all propositions as its thoughts. And so, for there to be a single necessarily existing mind that grounds all propositions as its thoughts is just what it means for a conceptually omniscient being to exist. And therefore, there exists a conceptually omniscient being. Since this necessary mind is pure actuality, one could continue to derive further divine attributes, such as omnipotence, immutability, simplicity, etc., from the fact that it is pure actuality, but I will stop here for the purposes of the video. As usual, thank you for watching, and of course I would love feedback on what you think works about the argument and what you think doesn't, perhaps. And as kind of a teaser, I did recently come up with sort of my own kind of ontological argument, which may be the topic of my next video.